I'm really happy to be here today with Nicholas Fleury, a member of my team, and someone who has a distinct Métis view on how being a public servant can impact positively the work of Canadian Coast Guard. And I'd like to hear a lot more about that, Nick.
I was personally born in Thompson, Manitoba, which is quite far north. I moved quite far south when I was about 4 years old. And we all often visited a town named Manitoba, and that's where my grandparents live. My grandparents built that house in Manitoba. That was a very small house, and it was often filled with a lot of people. I think that says something about the lack of land that my family was provided. But at the same time, it didn't take away from the fact that we all still knew we were family, and we all still knew that we wanted to be together nonetheless and celebrate.
You and I have discussed what it is to work in a uniformed environment, and I have been in uniformed departments my entire public service career, and to my mind, I've supported those uniforms every day, although I've never worn one. Do you want to talk to me a little bit about that?
It's definitely a question that hits very close to home. Both of my parents are RCMP members. My grandmother was a corrections officer in Manitoba, and some of my grandfather's relatives actually served in Canada's Expeditionary Force during World War I. So the uniform is definitely very close to home, but I think what it really represents to me is the idea that we need to work between our uniformed institutions and our Indigenous people in Canada. And I say our Indigenous people in Canada because I personally am Métis, and Nicole being First Nations, we often will use that language, but it may not always be appropriate, right? I think it's incredibly important that the respect be shown for the uniform as well, but at the same time, there needs to be a positive relationship to have that respect, right? So if we have instances where our Indigenous people in Canada feel as though they're not respected by a uniformed institution, that makes Indigenous relations and our work that much more challenging. The shared trauma that takes place in Canada through some of the uniformed history needs to be spoken about a little bit more, and I think we need to educate people about it as well. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, my grandfather describes many run-ins with the RCMP. He describes not being allowed to have deer. It was deemed illegal. So if you had deer, the RCMP would break into your house and they would take the deer from you, and you weren't allowed to feed yourself or your family. He jokes that they often didn't find any because they hid it, and it was not always nice, but it was what they had to do. And he goes so far as to describe a story as well where he finds a puppy. And he always really liked having puppies. I think a lot of people do. There's a joy in that, a very special joy. And he has a memory of the RCMP coming door to door looking for dogs. And at the time, these dogs are being deemed to be dangerous. They're disease-ridden, and it's illegal to own them. So he hides the puppy the first time. And the second time, the RCMP officers show up at the door, and they didn't hear them. There was a storm that night, and they couldn't hear the skidoos coming. And two officers in buffalo coats burst through the door. And he describes his puppy barking, almost as if to say, "Help me, save me." And then it knew that it was in trouble. And one of the officers proceeds to take the puppy, hold it down underneath the rudders of the skidoo, and drive over top of its head. So as a small boy, that's what he had lived with, and he witnessed. And as a Métis elder, he used to sing a song, "The Little Brown Dog," that I can only imagine he wrote with his mother as she used to sing it to him, to try to remember that story in a little bit of a more positive light. But it's stories like these that I think they go untold. I think they're heavily traumatic. You know, it's hard to sit and talk about today. And yet, without them, we're, just that much less educated, that much less aware. And I think it makes all the difference when it comes to Indigenous relations to understand that it's not just about, a title or perhaps even land, perhaps money. It has a lot to do with rectifying the feelings and the trauma and the emotional damage that took place as well.
I really want to take this opportunity to thank you for journeying with me and for being able to share what I know is really important history and thoughts. And I'll invite you to give us your last words.
I often speak of just learning and education, a willingness to take in new perspectives and to perhaps adjust your own perspective. I'd like to take a second and read some of my grandfather's words. I don't really like to go back to lose again to that time when I learned how to hate. I have to forgive, and I've done that because I have two boys that are RCMP. They don't know my story, but I told my youngest son, maybe one day you can read what I've written so you can get to know me better. And he said, Dad, I will. So he's going to read that, and I have to be okay with it. He needs to know about it, because there is nothing worse than leaving the worst behind for your kids to find out later after you are gone.